The story opens in the heavy, rhythmic silence of a neon-drenched alleyway, moments after a silent slaughter. The sensory contrast is sharp. The clinical, cold blue light of the skyscrapers above versus the hot, rhythmic pulsing of a red neon sign that reflects in the pooling blood on the asphalt. The air is thick, not with the sound of a struggle, but with the scent of ozone and iron, rainwater mixing with fresh copper. This immediate atmosphere establishes a world that is visually impossible, bridging the gap between ancient ritual and a high-stakes, dystopian reality. We are introduced to Akira, not through an act of violence, but through her absolute, terrifying composure. She stands at the center of the frame as an immovable anchor, her blindfold a symbol of her rejection of the world's chaos. While the four warriors around her, her ghost army, are frozen in a state of absolute submission, kneeling with heads bowed in a traditional jial, Akira remains the only upright figure in the rain. She is framed as a supernatural anomaly. She is physically present, yet her stillness suggests a ghost who has already transcended the need for sight. This introduction establishes her not as a mere assassin, but as a sovereign, the silent shogun, whose mere presence forces the world and the Korean kings who fear her to hold its breath. Her quietude sets the stage for the explosive, ideological war that is about to follow. In history class, we learned that the Industrial Revolution changed the way people worked and lived. It introduced new machinery, improved transportation, and led to the growth of cities. It was a pivotal moment in shaping the modern world. The inner sanctum was a place where the neon couldn't reach. It smelled of ancient cedar and the sharp, medicinal tang of crushed lotus root. Here, the hum of the city was replaced by the slow, deliberate drip of water onto a stone basin, a metronome for a woman whose life was measured in heartbeats and blade strokes. At the center of the darkness sat Master Oro, a man so old he seemed woven into the shadows of the floorboards. He didn't use a blindfold. His eyes were simply two milky spheres that had long ago traded light for something far more predatory. "The king has threatened the heavenly fire," Akira said, her voice dropping the cold authority she wore in the streets. She knelt, her forehead nearly touching the polished wood. "My ghosts are fast, but they cannot outrun a sun falling from the sky." Woro's laughter was a dry, papery sound. "You seek the deep blindness, not to see the enemy, but to become the vacuum they cannot strike. You want the power of the blind dragon." "I want my empire to survive," she countered. "The price is not silver, Akira. It is the thread," Oro whispered, leaning forward until the heat of his breath reached her. "To achieve the deep blindness, you must sever the last cord connecting you to the world of the living. No memories, no mercy, no tether to the name you bore before the veil. You will become a hollow vessel of pure judgment." Akira felt the weight of the wooden doll hidden in her robes, the one relic of a life she barely remembered. To save her people, she had to erase the very reason she protected them. "The king sees with gold and glass," Oro continued, his hand hovering over her blindfold. "But the dragon sees with the void. Are you ready to stop existing entirely?" The royal supply train was a subterranean serpent of chrome and pressurized steam, cutting through the industrial guts of the illegal zone. It carried the heavenly fire, catalysts, the chemical heart of the king's orbital threat. Akira stood on the rusted lip of an overpass, her blindfold fluttering in the artificial wind of the tunnel. Behind her, the four men from the alleyway and a dozen more stood like statues carved from the dark. They were her ghost army, and they shared a singular, terrifying trait. They did not breathe in unison. They moved in the gaps between heartbeats. "Iron and ozone," Akira whispered, the scent of the approaching maglev train stinging her senses. As the train roared beneath them, Akira stepped into the void. She didn't jump, she fell like a shadow. Her boots hit the roof of the lead car with the sound of a falling leaf. Behind her, the ghosts followed, their movements a synchronized blur of black silk. The royal guards inside never heard the breach. The door seals didn't hiss, they simply ceased to be. The fight that followed was a masterpiece of sensory deprivation. There were no battle cries, no clashing of steel. Akira moved through the narrow corridor of the cargo bay like a ribbon of smoke. Her blade found the gaps in the guards, pressurized armor with surgical precision. When a guard tried to scream, a ghost's hand was already there, silencing the throat before the air could vibrate. It was a massacre of absolute quiet. The only sound was the steady thrum of the maglev rails and the wet, heavy thud of bodies hitting the floor. Akira reached the central console, her hand hovering over the catalyst canisters. She had stolen the king's fire without waking the city. The aftermath of the train raid didn't bring the usual reprieve of the shadows. Instead, a new kind of light began to bleed into the illegal zone. Not the warm flicker of neon, but the cold, clinical strobing of high-frequency ultraviolet pulses. The king had stopped playing with soldiers. He had sent his surgeons. The eyes of the throne descended from the overpasses on localized gravity tethers. They didn't wear the traditional silk or the heavy plates of the H-Warang. Their suits were matte white, vacuum-sealed, and silent. Most striking were their helmets, wraparound visors glowing with a shifting emerald data stream. They didn't see with light, they saw with sonar, thermal mapping, and heartbeat echoes. Akira stood in the center of a flooded plaza, her ghost army fanned out behind her in their signature crescent formation. For the first time, she felt a ripple of genuine unease from her men. The air was vibrating with a low-frequency hum that disrupted the delicate inner-ear balance her style required. "Position," Akira commanded, her voice barely a breath. The response was a blinding flash. The sight-seekers didn't use bullets. They launched lumen shells that detonated in a sphere of 10 million lux. To a normal person, it was blinding. To Akira's ghosts, who navigated by the subtle shifts in ambient pressure and sound, the sudden thermal expansion of the air was like a physical wall. A sight-seeker blurred forward, his movements calculated by an onboard AI that predicted the trajectory of Akira's blade before she even drew it. The high-frequency hum intensified, a digital scream designed to drown out the blind dragon instinct. Akira's sword cleared its scabbard, but the strike was parried by a vibrating baton that hummed with the exact frequency of her own steel. The silence was broken. The king had finally found a way to make the ghosts bleed. The eyes of the throne had been pushed back, but the cost was carved into the walls of the sanctuary. In the frantic search for medical supplies within the shrine's deepest subcellar, a ghost had overturned a heavy, lacquered chest, not one belonging to the order, but an ancient relic of the building's previous life. Among the scattered scrolls and broken pottery lay a small, carved wooden doll. Akira's fingers brushed the grain of the wood. The moment her skin made contact, a violent tremor shook her composure. It was a kokushi, Japanese in origin, but it wore a hand-painted Korean hanbok of royal crimson. On the base, a single character was burned into the wood, the king's personal seal. The deep blindness was supposed to have erased her tethers, but the doll acted like a lightning rod for a lightning strike memory. She saw it, not through the void, but through eyes that once held light. She saw a burning village on the border. She saw a young, idealistic prince, now the king, reaching into the smoke to pull a shivering Japanese girl from the wreckage. He hadn't seen an enemy. He had seen a child who shouldn't exist in a war-torn world. He had hidden her. He had protected her. The blood on the doll wasn't from the recent battle. It was old, dark, and belonged to the guards who had died protecting her disappearance years ago. "I wasn't an infection he sought to cure," Akira whispered, her grip tightening until the wood groaned. "I was a secret he couldn't keep." She realized then that the king wasn't hunting a criminal empire. He was trying to bury his own greatest mercy, the girl who proved that the king's heart was once softer than his crown. The air in the inner sanctum was no longer cold. It was stagnant. Master Aro sat as he always did, a shadow within shadows, but his milky eyes seemed to pierce through the silk of Akira's blindfold. He didn't need to see the wooden doll hidden in her sleeve to know the rhythm of her heart had changed. "The thread has become a chain," Aro's voice rasped, sounding like dry leaves skittering over a tombstone. "You have rediscovered the girl who was saved. That girl is a ghost of a different kind, Akira. She is a weakness that breathes." Akira's hand instinctively went to the doll. The memory of the prince's warm hand and the cold smoke was a fire she hadn't asked for. "He saved me, master. The king didn't build this war out of hate. He built it out of fear of what I represent, his own humanity. And that humanity will be the cord that strangles your empire," Oro hissed, leaning into the dim light of a single tallow candle. "The eyes of the throne are coming. They do not have memories. They have directives. To reach the choice of zero, you must burn the doll. You must sever the vision of the heart, the part of you that still sees the king as a savior." He held out a withered hand, gesturing toward the stone basin. "Drop the relic. Let the water take the wood, and let the void take your soul. Only a hollow vessel can house the blind dragon. If you keep the girl, the shogun dies, and with her, every ghost who calls you mother." The choice was a jagged edge. To protect her family of shadows, she had to become a monster of the void. Akira felt the weight of the veil, not the silk over her eyes, but the heavy, suffocating duty of a ruler who could no longer afford to love. The heavenly fire didn't descend as a flame. It arrived as a void. At exactly 0300, the pulse hit. The persistent electrical hum of Neo-Soul, the heartbeat of a million neon tubes, snapped into a terrifying, absolute silence. From the skyscrapers of the district to the deepest gutters of the illegal zone, the light died. The city didn't just go dark, it vanished. For the royal army, the blackout was a tactical nightmare. Their high-tech eyes of the throne sputtered, their AI processors struggling to map a world where every thermal signature was masked by the sudden drop in ambient temperature. In the pitch-black labyrinth of the slums, the king's soldiers were suddenly children stumbling in a basement. But for Akira, the dark was home. She stood on the roof of the central shrine, her head tilted. Without the pollution of light and electronic interference, her senses expanded like a blooming lotus. She could hear the frantic clatter of a soldier's mag boots 3 blocks away. She could smell the ozone of a short-circuited visor. She could feel the displacement of air as her ghost army drifted through the shadows, moving with a lethal fluidity that sight beings could never replicate. "The choice of zero," she whispered into the freezing wind. The wooden doll sat heavy in her sleeve, a stubborn anchor she hadn't yet dropped into the basin. The first breach occurred at the south gate. A royal heavy infantry unit, blinded and panicked, began firing blind into the darkness. The strobing muzzle flashes were the only heartbeat the city had left. Akira didn't reach for her radio. She simply tapped her blade against her scabbard, a rhythmic code that vibrated through the steel of the city. The hunt had begun. In a world where no one could see, the woman who had never used her eyes was the only one who truly reigned. The center of the shrine erupted in a cascade of sparking wires and reinforced steel. General Han, the king's personal executioner, stepped through the breach. He didn't wear a visor. He wore a mask of cold, scarred skin and carried a heavy, serrated dew that hummed with kinetic energy. "The king gave you a life," Han roared, his voice echoing in the hollow darkness. "You turned it into a weapon against him." The duel was not a fight. It was an earthquake. Akira moved with the fluid grace of the blind dragon, parrying strikes that would have shattered stone. But Han was a veteran of the border wars. He didn't aim for her heart, he aimed for her senses. He detonated a high-frequency sonic burst at point-blank range, a localized shriek that rattled Akira's skull. In that split second of disorientation, Han's blade didn't draw blood, it drew silk. The serrated edge caught the knot of her blindfold. With a violent jerk, the black fabric was torn away. For the first time in a decade, light flooded in. It wasn't the soft glow of the void. It was a violent, screaming assault of color and motion. The flickering sparks of the ruined electronics were like needles in her retinas. The sight of Han's scarred face, the crimson of the fallen ghosts, and the cold, terrifying vastness of the room hit her with the weight of a mountain. She stumbled, her blind dragon rhythm shattered by the overwhelming noise of seeing. Han raised his blade for the killing blow. Akira stared up at him, her eyes dark, clear, and filled with a sudden, agonizing humanity, locking onto his. In that moment, the wooden doll slipped from her sleeve, clattering onto the floor between them. She saw the king's seal. She saw the general's hesitation. She had to choose. She could strike through the blur of her tears with the rage of a monster, or she could find the girl who had been saved and offer a peace the king never expected. The neon grid of Neo-Seoul hummed back to life, but it flickered with a new, hesitant rhythm. In the center of the devastated shrine, Akira stood over General Han. Her blade was a hair's breadth from his throat, her eyes, unveiled and piercing, tracking the frantic pulse in his neck. She didn't look like a ghost anymore. She looked like a reckoning. "Tell the king," she said, her voice cutting through the dying echoes of the siege, "that the girl he saved is gone, but the woman he created is staying." She withdrew her steel with a sharp, metallic hiss. Han, gasping for air and clutching his shattered pride, watched as she picked up the blood-stained wooden doll. She didn't drop it into the water. She tucked it into her belt, a reminder of a mercy that had become a mandate. The retreat of the royal army was silent, a funeral procession for an absolute authority that had finally met its limit. When Akira stepped out onto the balcony of the illegal zone, the ghost army emerged from the shadows. Hundreds of them, kneeling not in submission, but in a unified, terrifying loyalty. The king watched from his high palace, his heavenly fire coordinates locked, yet his hand remained stayed. To strike her now was to ignite a city that had found its true heart in the dark. Akira looked up at the palace, her gaze steady. She was the Japanese woman who shouldn't exist, a historical error that had rewritten the future. She had rejected the choice of zero to embrace the weight of being seen. The truce was no longer a secret, it was a scar. The silent shogun had transitioned from a legend whispered in alleys to a sovereign the world could no longer ignore. In the rainy neon of the morning, Akira reigned, not as a ghost, but as the shadow that defined the light.